Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So we're going to kind of kick things off. I think Renaud brought some kind of a deck to get us started, to kind of give us something to hang this conversation on a little bit, give us some kind of talking points. So we'll spend the first few minutes going over that, and then we'll come back, have a bit of a chat, and then get questions from everyone. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds very good. So I'm going to explain a bit more what we mean by distributed commerce and what it means for us to taking APIs to the next level. We've been early believers in the power of APIs. Our first API was launched in 1 year after we started. APIs were becoming popular, but not quite there yet. But we saw it as a great way to open our platform to external developers to build functionality that we would not be building because it was not our core focus. And we've built a quite extensive platform through that process. We now have probably thousands of integrations that have been built, and we're thinking about what's next for this ecosystem and how do we leverage these APIs to go even farther in the possibility of integrations that we build for our customers. So first, a few words about Eventbrite to set the context. So today we're the world's largest ticketing and event technology platform. We've processed more than 10 billion worth of ticket sales since we started in 2006. Last year we had about 50 million customers purchasing more than 200 million tickets on the platform. And our official app platform marketplace called Spectrum has more than 100 applications of the like of Salesforce, WordPress, MailChimp, and other big partners that we work with, listed and actively marketed to our customer base. One thing we realized about a couple of years ago is that your attention is being spent more and more on fewer and fewer apps. So if you look at the time you spend on your mobile phone, for example, a big chunk of that is on a few platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and a few others. And our goal of bringing the world together through live experiences was becoming harder and harder to do without having a presence on these platforms. So we thought about how can we leverage our APIs to make that possible. How do we work with the likes of Facebook, Instagram, and company to really bring a better experience for you guys on the devices that you use every day and the apps that you use every day? So event discovery, and I'm sure you've noticed that on Facebook, for example, they push events quite a bit nowadays. You see where your friends are going. It's all very much promoted inside the app. And it's becoming a lot more integrated, seamless, and personalized. So they know what you like, and they're going to recommend things that are appropriate for your taste. And for us, distributed commerce brings the events that you might be interested in the places where you're already spending your time. So we bring that inventory of tickets that we have available through our event organizers right there in the applications that you use every day. So you don't have to jump between two different applications. You don't even have to install ours. And event organizers benefit from having these integrations work almost magically. Once you post your Eventbrite event, it gets distributed to all these great partners. Over the last year, we've launched quite a few. So on the search side with Google, we have deeper integration on the search results when you're looking for things to do. Social networks, Facebook, Instagram. Instagram is the last one we launched. It allows event organizers to put a get tickets link on their profile to directly link to the events that they have on our platform. We have a lot of music players like Bands in Town, Spotify, Songkick, event discovery platform for music that we've deeply integrated with. We also have ticketing aggregators like SeatGeek and GoldStar who represent our inventory. So there's a video that's supposed to show, but I guess. All right. The first thing we did to make it as easy as possible to get started with integration is build an embedded checkout flow. So it's basically a JavaScript that any partner can put on their site to power the entire checkout right there at the click of a button. So it's built entirely on our purchase API. So it's really a front end built on top of our API to make development much faster, because the partner doesn't have to build all the integrations with all the endpoints. It's encapsulated into this UI that they will be eventually able to customize and make it really part of their integration flow. So this gets us really started very quickly with partners, because I think a lot of partnerships are not necessarily slam dunks, so you want to be able to test them early on to see if there's enough synergies to make this an official partnership. And this is a great way to package our APIs with an extra layer that accelerates the process of integration. It's used as a first step for a lot of our partnerships today. This one is fairly simple as well. It exposes a get tickets link on your Instagram profile. It's a start. I think this is going to evolve and probably will be a lot closer to our Facebook integration style down the line. On Spotify, it's mostly a sharing of our inventory and tagging of all the artists that are performing at the different venues that we have on the platform. So it's mostly event discovery, but deeply integrated into their product. As you find the band that you like, you'll see what's on tour near them and when they're coming. And you can get all the events at other locations as well. Eventually, I think the Find Tickets button will also be on the Spotify side, but this is a work in progress with them. We have a much deeper integration with bands in town, for example, where the tickets are surfaced right as you're browsing, and the purchase happens on the bands in town side. It goes all the way to actually your QR code. So now you don't need to download our app anymore. You can just show up with your Bands in Town app, show the QR code, and be led into the venue for your events. So how is that possible? The Search API is the one we launched in 2007, so it's been a core functionality that we've offered through our APIs. It enables you to filter all the events. We have several millions every year, so you can pinpoint based on location, based on interest, based on the type of artists that are performing. That exposes our inventory to partners. Then we have our Questions API, which allows you, a bit like you guys actually, to collect information during the checkout process. So the partner can help the organizer define what questions they will be asking during registration, and collecting that and reporting that and integrating that into the app down the line. And then the latest one that we launched about a year and a half ago, it's not public, we're making it available to these partners that are fairly vetted, is the Purchase API. So that opens up our entire purchasing process. It was quite a lot of work to get built, but now that we have it, it opens a lot of possibilities for much deeper integration with a wide range of partners. I'm going to talk about our Facebook integration, because I think that's the most advanced of all. We've spent a lot of time, and there's a lot of problems that are not necessarily custom to APIs. The synchronization of data. So Facebook has their own schema for how they store events. Facebook events has been a feature for a very long time. So the synchronization between our details and their details has to happen almost in real time. So we have, of course, our APIs, but they had to build a lot of APIs themselves to enable this bi-directional conversation that we're having on a constant basis to make sure everything is synchronized. Inventory synchronization, so as sales happen, the events are being sold on Eventbrite, on Facebook, on all these other platforms. We have to make sure that every purchase gets reflected into what's available, so they can show that the event is sold out. That, again, relies a lot on very strong APIs on both sides and webhooks to connect the two and make sure that one gets updated at the right time. Purchase synchronization, that's probably the one that's the hardest to do. And for that, we leverage the third-party API. We use Braintree Extend, which allows us to share tokens. So when you go through the purchase process on Facebook, the card that you have on file with Facebook is the one that we're going to use to charge for the ticket. This is really powerful when you can share the payment infrastructure across partners. That makes a lot of experiences a lot easier to develop. We don't have to get your credit card entered again, so it's much less friction. a lot smoother integration, and something that I think will be critically important as you decide which payment providers you want to use. If integrations is a big part of your strategy, you need to make sure this is possible, because that's going to really change the game for what you can do. So our checkout on Facebook integration is really seamless, so everything happens on the Facebook side. We are only interacting through our APIs. Our brand is shown, we're the ticketing provider, but the purchase happens on Facebook. The QR code is delivered to your Facebook app. So it's very encapsulated in the place that you use every day to do your social networking with friends, but also to discover things to do. It's an example for us of how we're going to think about APIs going forward. It's been like a co-development effort. We helped them build their APIs. They helped us they told us what was wrong with ours. So we iterated over the integration to make it as easy for us, but also as easy for them to implement their own flows to replicate a lot of the functionality that we have. It forced us to think about these integrations as real products, and maybe that's the biggest change when I'm thinking about taking APIs to the next level, is how do you treat them as an integral part of your product and have the same process around delivering an experience to a set of customers that you have when you build your core product. These are equally powerful, even more powerful maybe than the product that we have. And treating it as a product that is collaboratively worked on by two different teams really helped deliver on the promise that we had to bring the full experience inside Facebook. So we are re-architecting the team to take that into account, to really work on these partnerships as projects, and to expand the functionality that we provide to our clients who are event organizers in a much more pleasant and exciting way for our customers. And it pays off. We actually sold millions of tickets so far in 2017 through these integrations. So it has been worth all the work that we've put in. It's definitely a need from consumers to not have to install too many apps. So we've leveraged that and delivered for our customers. So that was a quick presentation on what we've done in the last few months. And I'll have a quick chat with Jason. Tell us what you're doing on the platform side, because you're...
Yeah, no, I think we had a little bit of a chance to talk before this, and I got a bit of a preview looking around at the kind of things Eventbrite's been working on. And I think for Typeform, the thing that I like about what we share in common here is, with Typeform, we're working with sort of, marketers and product folks and whoever else that are using forms to collect information from their customers. So when you start looking at why does integration matter, how does that fit into your business, I think that there's always this potential mistake of either build it and they'll come, or you glue it on top of the business, and then if things don't work out, it's really easy to just shave it off and move on. So I think Eventbrite's a lot further down this path, and I feel really privileged to get to chat with you and learn more about this. But I'm curious. To me, taking things to the next level from just building an API is building a business around it. So I'm curious, as you guys got into thinking about more integrated experiences, how did your thinking shift, both in terms of you mentioned some of the product stuff, but more around kind of KPIs for the business. How did those change when you started looking at this? And what is it that you're looking at as kind of your key figures that help you understand what drives the business through the APIs?
So I think for us, there's really two big values from being a platform, and that translates into stickiness of the product. So once you have these organizers using a few integrations that we've built, it's much harder for them to go to another platform that doesn't have these integrations. So one thing we measure, it's the amount of ticket sales driven by organizers who are using, I think, 2 or 3, I can't remember which one we use, but 2 or 3 integrations in addition to using us. And we try to drive that up, so make organizers use a lot more of these integrations so that we become even more sticky. when we're at the center of their universe and they are plugging all the different tools that they're using into our core APIs, I think we benefit a lot from making it harder for the competition to come in and replace our entire solution. So that's one KPI we look at. On the utility side of the platform, and that's something we're planning to invest in, mostly based on the result of this type of integration. Now we have the capabilities of doing ticketing, for example, for not just our events, but for other events. And here we're going to look at it as purely on revenue, like how much revenue can we drive from having APIs available more as a utility function that replicates a lot of the things we've built, but apply to other types of customers.
Yep. You know, one thing I think we've learned getting into some of our kind of early integrated experiences is that while looking at churn or retention or stickiness, whatever you want to call it, is super valuable, it's a trailing metric. It takes a while to get there. So when you stand something up new, how are you kind of learning quickly what's going to work and where the kind of kinks might be in that process?
It's true that it depends on the integrations. I think some of them are really fast. Like with Facebook, they have such a broad user base that you can really quickly tell whether something is going to work or not. When it's a much smaller company with no real sales process around selling the solution, it takes a while. So we try to make it as lightweight as possible by having the right components that they can build on. Eventually, we are the provider of business for a lot of solutions out there because we have the biggest number of event organizers on our platform compared to any other. So it's up to us, I think, to really promote these integrations in a very active way so that we not only encourage stickiness, but we also learn faster by bringing more clients to these integrations. Yeah. So I think it's our responsibility as well to drive the business of the partners who are integrating with us and not just build it or open it and they will come and build on it and we have nothing to do. I think there's a lot of value in helping partners with a true ecosystem. Yeah.
No, I think that's it's one piece that getting into really building an ecosystem is you're really in a relationship management thing now.
For sure.
So I'm curious, when you guys kind of first got the ball rolling on all this, what kind of organizational changes or like different kinds of profiles did you have to start bringing in to address that need to maintain and grow relationships?
So the first versions of the API were mostly built by the development teams that were responsible for the area that they were building. So it was fairly disorganized, I think, in the way we expose things, and quite reactive in the needs of the bigger partners who came in. So the first hires we did was a biz dev person to organize these relationships, to reach out to the partners we wanted to integrate who didn't necessarily see the benefit, and to find a way to quantify the relationship. I think the best relationships are win-win relationships, so you have to structure them in a way that both parties get a lot of benefits from. Not easy all the time, but if you don't start having that conversation early on, it makes it much harder in the future. And then treating the platform as a product, I think, is important. So for like core product companies like Eventbrite, which started purely as a SaaS platform with no real extensions to APIs, it was a change in mindset and the way we treated the API. It's not just something out there on the side, like you mentioned, like it was for us at the beginning where we didn't really care for it and say, oh yeah, let the community be creative and do things. Now we treat it as a real product and we'll be making a lot of changes in the next few months to do many things. I think you have to explain what product you're selling, what value you have for potential partners, what features you're supporting and not supporting, how you can integrate very quickly, get started. All these need to be part of or are expected to be part of developer API documentation at this point. Yeah. So that relies more on more traditional teams with product, UX, design, profiles that we haven't added to the mix, but we'll be adding shortly.
Yeah, good luck. Those are tough hires.
Yes, for sure.
It's really tricky finding folks with this kind of experience.
I mean,
And
all the utility companies do it very well,
yeah.
and that's I think, as we embark on the journey of transforming ourselves to be more of a utility platform, that becomes a lot more important to show what we're selling.
Yeah, yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, along the lines of org design, I think, one struggle that I've seen in the past, and certainly at Typeform we're starting to get a handle on, is how do you prioritize these things, right? I mean, I imagine Eventbrite has a lot of potential leads and opportunities coming in through business development. Obviously, like, how big of an impact could it be is one thing, but then when it comes down to it, in kind of the biggest relationships, you've got to commit resources to this.
For sure.
So, you made some hint earlier to shifting how you're organizing teams around this in terms of profiles, but then, how are you making those decisions and not getting overstretched with too big of commitments?
I think deciding that you're going to take on initiatives like distributed commerce as a goal for the company is one way to structure the focus. So that helped us by having clear metrics on wanting to be on as many platforms as possible, as quickly as possible, to really distribute that purchasing process to the places that are relevant. After that, I think it's a lot of gut feeling, unfortunately, because you don't have any data to back it up. So you have to be able to be very agile with your relationships. And things like our embedded checkout, I think, will allow us to quickly determine whether a partnership is worth pursuing and investing in. And as you start getting data, then you can decide a bit more, less naively, I would say, whether to spend your money. But yes, it has to be a commitment and a belief that this is important and this is going to align with our company objectives. Yeah. I think if you have unclear company objectives, then it becomes harder to prioritize. And then you might do things for small partners that are not going to move the needle. So always keeping that in mind, the business impact of what you're doing is critical, I think.
Yeah. I lost my train of thought there. So
tell us about your platform initiative, because that's fairly recent, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we launched our kind of new developer portal back in September. We kind of came out of the gate with a partnership with Autopilot. I think in our case, especially for marketers, collecting this kind of human input is really what drives a whole automated campaign. We certainly work with, it's a very horizontal product. People use it all kinds of different ways. But marketers certainly are a sweet spot for us. And feeding those automated campaigns to the human touch at the beginning is really a key. And I think Autopilot, kind of has that right sweet spot where we fit in and it drops into place. We've also done some work with Cloudflare on kind of making it easier to embed Typeforms through just kind of point and click and not really having to write any code. I think that's been a bit of a thought process change over this last year is, from the business folks, they look and say, well, if APIs are going to power our growth in some ways, that must mean that we need all the developers. But the reality is, for our customers, they actually don't want to deal with developers. So it's actually making it easy for them to point and click and get what they need out of the product. And so in some ways, we need the community of developers so that we make sure that we have a really solid product and that we're offering a place to experiment. But at the end of the day, it's really about working with kind of the bigger partners that gets the functionality to our end users that they're looking for. So I mean, I think that's been a real shift in thinking for us, and then kind of my team sort of addressing those relationships with dev community and with partners, and making sure that we're bringing that perspective back to the business on what's the shared value in this kind of deal that we're talking about. I think we've got a lot more things coming up in the next few months that'll start rolling out. So it's all a little bit quiet at this point, but like I said, this is all kind of 6 months old for us, so really interesting to learn from you.
So who were your first hires? Because you just started building the team.
Biz dev. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we actually had some folks internally who had a little bit of a mix of engineering and marketing backgrounds. We were able to kind of move over from other teams to help get us started. But yeah, making a key biz dev hire right off the bat has been critical for us to make those relationships happen, and really to be able to speak business. I mean, I think, like, my background's in kind of back-end engineering. when I get involved in these discussions, I can't help but get into feasibility. Like, you know, technically, what are we going to need? But you're right that like the real learning there is, no, step back and like what's the kind of core unit of value that we share here, and how is that number going up going to help us both grow? If you can't get that part right, we don't even need to involve the engineers yet.
Yeah.
So that's...
You can spend a lot of time on useless integrations.
Yeah.
We've done it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm curious, you know, a lot of the stuff you were showing looks like it's, you know, running in other kind of platforms, ecosystems. How much of that work has your team been doing versus, you know, the kind of input from some of these other potentially bigger platforms, I would assume?
It highly depended on the partner. So Facebook, for example, spent probably as much time, if not more, on developing their own events API layer. They redid everything that they were doing around Facebook events in general. So we were not the only driver for that work, but a big part of the work resulted from our integration efforts. Other partners haven't spent as much time, so it really depends on the power relationship, and I'm sure you all know that, like who has the most to gain in the integration. Usually is the one who does the least work, because the other one has to prove that they are worthy, I would say, of the partnership. So I think it depends on the alignment of interest and who has the most to gain. Usually they're the ones who have to do most of the work. But if you make it easy with things like embedded checkout, and we could build similar widgets for most of our APIs, like you make the work of, or you make much less work for your team and much more work on the business dev side to really figure out what the right experience is for the end user. Yeah,
I think that's kind of our thought process is that the developer community is really a way that, yeah, I mean, we're providing some value to just sort of whoever developers, but in a way it's helping us understand what could potentially block up the works in putting together something big between two platforms.
Because in the end, people consume user interfaces. They don't consume API endpoints. So
that's right.
Someone has to build the UI that they're going to be interacting with. And if you provide a much quicker way to do that, I think that's quite powerful.
But we are in a room full of developers, and we should talk just a little bit of tech with some of the time we have here. And I guess as you start stacking more dependencies on top of these APIs, more calls coming in, you know, more volume, obviously reliability of all this stuff becomes a factor, and making sure that not only is it easy to get up and running, but it stays running. How has this kind of big push toward, you know, platform enablement changed the way that you handle things?
Much more prudently, I would say.
Carefully.
So I think the biggest change we've made is treating our internal developers equally well as our external developers. So when you consume your own APIs, then you have to make sure nothing breaks, and that if you introduce new changes, there's the right communication path for notifying all the right parties and having the versioning that you need. So it's still something we're actively working on. I wouldn't say I think our platform has not evolved as fast as it could have because we've been very prudent and we haven't wanting to make too many non-backwards compatible changes. So I think relieving that pressure by having a clear versioning system that introduces new changes only for new customers who upgrade their API integrations will be I think it's critically needed nowadays, and we haven't done the work to get there. That's something we'll invest in very shortly. The services migration, I think when we started, microservices didn't really exist, so we had the monolith like everybody else, and we've been chipping away at the monolith over the last 4 or 5 years, creating microservices without stopping the business, which is always a perilous exercise. But with the focus on platform, I think it forces us to take our internal developers and put them in the shoes of the external developers and not treat them differently. So if they want to have proper documentation, it's going to be up to them to create it and tell us when it's wrong and make sure we do all the proper mechanisms that modern ecosystems are supposed to provide. Yeah. That's something very important, and dog fooding is probably the best way to get there.
Yeah, I heard somebody the other day say, drink your own champagne. because we don't make dog food. Yeah, we tend to say that like our first developer community is inside our company, and that like when we went through this microservices transformation over the last few years, and same as you, we're sort of 2 years in, probably many years to go in chipping away at the monolith. But you know, basically, sort of our relaunch of our front end is totally driven off of the microservices which have been externalized. Yep. Which is exactly the same things that are on the developer portal. And I guess I'm curious, like, how your strategy may have changed in terms of building, like, the public APIs versus just externalizing microservices over time.
Well, I think the front-end framework that you use has a big influence. So we went for React purely accessing the API infrastructure for our core product, which forces us to use our APIs. If you don't have that forcing function, then you're always going to find backend views that can do the work and not expose all the APIs that you need to really, from A to Z, perform whatever is needed on the UI that you're creating. So having the right front-end technology coupled with the only choice being APIs, you limit the possibility of not using your own products. Yeah. So you can make choices that force that development process to be aligned with the interests both of internal and external developers.
So
and mobile is the first one that pushed us in that direction. Because
yeah.
Mobile, there's no web view you can create.
Yeah, because you can't do mobile without APIs.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was actually at Braintree and PayPal before I was at Typeform, and it was a lot of that same kind of, you know, you have to face those issues when mobile comes in. I guess I'm curious, beyond kind of internal feedback on champagne drinking and this sort of thing, what kind of metrics do you look at on kind of developer experience that bring you any broader meaning to, you know, whether or not things are working well?
I think performance is the big one. We look at that very closely. We don't want integrations that look painfully slow. So having good metrics around all performance-related behavior, I would say, is really important. Adding enough capacity. We have a very bursty business model. Events can sell very quickly. So we need to be able to react with that. I think the webhooks infrastructure is one we look at very closely as well. When you're relying on certain events to happen and to trigger other things on your side, making sure they are reliably sent with no delay and trigger the right things is really important. After that, it's reporting better when you're doing the integration work. That's always painful, and as much as you can provide detailed analysis of what has been tried, all the inputs and outputs, and where you're doing things wrong, automatically, I think you accelerate these integration processes.
Yep. All right, so I think we have about 5-10 minutes, and we've got some questions coming up on the board here from the audience that we can kind of chip away at here. You had kind of mentioned backward compatibility, and someone asked, how do you manage backward compatibility when you change the APIs? So, I mean, you know, you can say we're not sure yet if it sounds like you're working on it, but I'm curious, you know, your general thoughts on it.
Well, we've tried to make changes that are backwards compatible, except maybe for adding new fields and things like that we consider backwards compatible, but not everybody agrees. So I think agreeing on the definition of what's backwards compatible, then having the proper versioning, and we have switches in the API that allows us to launch things without creating a new version completely. So a switch allows you to tell the API, it's like feature flags for APIs, basically. So we've implemented that, and we're going to use that for proper versioning. So it will be a set of switches that allow us to have a single code base still powering multiple versions of the API. I think communication is a lot harder. Right? We've had our API V1, the one I created in 2007, still live, and we have one customer on it, a big customer, a big partner, because we're not equally featured with the V3 API that we launched, which is the modern version of it. So deprecation, I think, is a lot more aggressive. Deprecation is something that you should think about early on, because it's going to handicap you over time otherwise.
Yeah, we actually just a month or two ago, announced that in July we'll deprecate our V1 API, which was very simple and same as you, built by some developers, didn't think much about it. Not the most performant thing, holding us back in a variety of ways. So we'll see how it goes. We may end up with that one big customer, but
I think you have to be aggressive and handle the
I think that's
complaints.
a piece that we also invested in early in the team, is having sort of developer relations coordinator, right? Like somebody who really just talks to everyone. I think in our case, one struggle is trying to actually get in touch with the actual developer at that company. Because quite often the account sign-up isn't, who you need to be in touch with.
And sometimes they outsource the development of the integration, and they don't know who built it anymore. So there's a lot of overhead costs for partners who are deprecating.
At PayPal, one kind of dirty secret there that not many people realize is they've been building APIs for 15 years, and they've never deprecated anything.
That's true.
It's crazy.
We used IPNs for a very long time, and I think we still have a few things in there.
If it drives the business, it's hard to shut it down.
Yeah.
Next one up is sort of how or where do you start when designing a new API?
Well, I think it starts with having good standards, some common terminology across the board so that people know what to use, how to define variables, what is a timestamp, like all these basic blocks. And then more and more, we're switching to a design-first approach, so proposing what the design will look like, thinking about the use case, both for the internal product that they want to build, but also how you're going to open it up to the world afterwards. And we have an architecture guild that reviews these proposals to give feedback, align differences in standards, or correct things, or suggest better ways. I think the validation before you start coding is very important. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of time coding something that's not going to be openable when you decide to. Yeah. It's not intuitive. I think a lot of developers like to build as they go versus thinking about the interface much earlier in the project. So I think we're going to have to do a lot of training for our developers to understand the process and to slightly shift to have more of a product approach to API design as well. Like think about all the use cases you're going to have for this API, clearly lay down all these use cases and see how your API interface will be able to cater to these use cases in particular. And I think building a front end on top of it is a really good way to validate that the interface is going to work. I think with modern interfaces, you have to think a lot more about batching your calls, for example. Like having a UI that exposes 10 things and having to make 10 calls to update it is not efficient. It's not going to be efficient on the web or mobile. So how do you create the right API standards to help make these calls efficient? Because if your team has this problem, like external developers will have similar problems. Yeah. So taking these assumptions early on and reviewing critically the API design to make sure this is accounted for will make for faster development in the end, because you'll have fewer iterations.
Yeah, as we got through building our kind of initial microservice infrastructure, that's really, we started with kind of Open API as a way to spec out what the APIs would look like in premise before we built anything. Like some of it as much as a year in advance. Granted, it changed by the time we got to it. But I mean, obviously I was one of the founding members of the Open API Linux Foundation initiative, obviously a bit of a fan. I actually would say though that in general, sketching it out in the spec and as much as you can provide a mock, right? That because those front-end developers, before your whole back-end gets built, have a chance to actually try something, get that kind of tactile feedback of actually using an API. So we're definitely big fans of the design first thing as well. Which I guess leads to the next question nicely, which is how do you document your API? I know in our case we sort of single source of truth everything off of the Open API spec, and then kind of add content on within the portal that's related to it. But I'm curious about your case.
Poorly, I would say. Currently, let's be honest. So we want to get to that model where it's single source of truth next to the code if possible. Yeah. But that's not the way we've evolved so far. So it's going to take one of these big initiatives to rewrite our, and we have too many places with documentation because we have a set that's exposed to the public, we have internal APIs, we have some that are open to specific partners, and there are some that are open only to our mobile developers. So it's a lot of complexity in how you manage these different sources, and I would say you have to realize when what you've been using doesn't scale anymore. And so we have a big H2 goal of redesigning how we do documentation across the board to take more of that design, API design first, documentation first if possible as well, so that you have less iteration and one source for all documentation, which is very important.
No, it's definitely a cultural shift. I know when I first stepped into Typeform like 2.5 years ago, that was one of the first topics I brought up. And it was really like a year before I really saw everyone kind of go, I get it, and I'm hanging on to this now, and this is important. So it's, I think the other piece of it is knowing that you've been doing API since 2007. There weren't a lot of great tools for this kind of stuff back then.
There were none.
Yeah, no, it's, all right, I was being generous. There was Waddle, technically, but...
Even REST wasn't defined properly.
Yeah,
still
exactly.
Isn't defined
no, it's
properly.
still not defined at all. So I don't know, maybe this was probably our last one by the time, but what is the next level of APIs for you? I think maybe that's more of a question on the title of our session.
I think it's more the mindset around APIs, so the era of push it live and people will come up with great solutions, I think is coming to an end. And thinking about how do you make integration a lot faster by building these front-end components, these SDKs on top of your infrastructure, building the reporting APIs that you need to also report on the health of the relationship. These are new things, and they need to be, I think, scoped as well as the rest so that you can move fast, be agile, and talk to a lot of partners. Because the health of your business, I think, hugely depends, for most businesses, on how fast they can build this ecosystem around their core product. Yeah. Nowadays, this is kind of expected for a lot of these systems to be talking to each other. So if you're not in a position to offer that very quickly, I think your APIs become not as useful as they could be to drive the business. And the business of APIs is a whole other topic, but I think that's becoming a lot more critical these days than the quality of your API in itself.
Yeah, the TLDR for me on this topic is stop thinking APIs and think how to make a platform business, right? Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us, and thank you all for sticking it out. I think we're up on time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.